Have you ever felt the quiet shift in someone you love? The kind of shift that doesn't happen with a dramatic argument or a sudden goodbye, but instead creeps in slowly, almost invisibly. One day everything feels normal, conversations flow. There is warmth, familiarity, the sense that you are building something real together, and then something changes. At first it's subtle, a message that takes longer to answer, a conversation that feels a little shorter, a tone that feels slightly colder than before. You tell yourself you might be imagining it, but deep inside, a quiet voice starts whispering that something is different. That voice grows louder each day. You begin replaying conversations in your mind, wondering if you said something wrong, wondering if you pushed too hard, wondering if the connection you felt so deeply is somehow slipping through your fingers. When someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment begins to pull away, the experience can feel deeply confusing. It's not always obvious. There is rarely a clear moment where they say they are leaving. Instead, there are small behaviors, subtle patterns, quiet changes that slowly create emotional distance. For the person on the other side, it can feel like watching a door close in slow motion. You're still standing in the same room, but the warmth that once filled the space is disappearing. And the hardest part is not always the distance itself, but the uncertainty. You wonder if this is temporary. You wonder if they still care. You wonder if there is something you can do to bring them back. The truth is, understanding these patterns can change everything. Because when you recognize the signs early, you stop blaming yourself for something that was never truly about you. You begin to see the deeper emotional patterns at play, the fears that often live beneath the surface of dismissive avoidant behavior. And most importantly, you begin to understand how to respond in a way that protects your heart and supports your healing. To understand why this shift happens, you have to look inside the mind of someone who learned very early in life that emotional closeness can feel overwhelming. People with dismissive avoidant attachment often grow up in environments where independence is valued more than vulnerability. As a result, they become experts at relying on themselves. They learn how to suppress emotional needs rather than express them. On the outside, they may appear confident, calm, and self-sufficient, but underneath that, independence is a deeply ingrained belief that depending on others can lead to disappointment, pressure, or loss of control. When a relationship begins, they may feel excited and drawn to the connection just like anyone else. In the early stages, closeness can feel safe because emotional investment is still growing slowly. But as the bond deepens and the relationship becomes more meaningful, something inside them begins to react. Emotional intimacy can start to feel threatening rather than comforting. The deeper the connection becomes, the more their internal alarm system activates. It tells them they are getting too close, that they might lose their independence, that they might become emotionally exposed in a way that feels unsafe. Instead of expressing these fears directly, they often respond by creating distance, not always intentionally, and not always consciously. Sometimes they don't even fully understand why they suddenly feel the urge to step back. They just know that something inside them feels uncomfortable, and distance becomes the easiest way to calm that discomfort. This is why their behavior can feel so confusing to the person who loves them. One moment they appear engaged and present, and the next moment they seem emotionally unavailable. The shift is not always about a lack of feelings. Often it is about the fear of those feelings becoming too powerful. One of the earliest signs that a dismissive avoidant may be emotionally leaving is something so subtle that many people overlook it at first. Communication begins to change. Messages that once came quickly now take hours or even days. Conversations that once flowed naturally begin to feel mechanical. Responses become shorter, less curious, less emotionally engaged. At first you might think they are simply busy or distracted. Life gets hectic for everyone sometimes, and it's natural to give someone the benefit of the doubt. But slowly the pattern becomes clearer. The enthusiasm that once filled your conversations begins to fade. When you share something meaningful, their response might feel distant or neutral. The emotional energy between you starts to weaken. What makes this especially painful is that the change rarely comes with an explanation. You are left trying to interpret silence, trying to read meaning into small details. Did they lose interest? Are they upset about something? Are they slowly preparing to leave? This uncertainty can create a powerful emotional spiral. The more distance you feel, the more you may try to reconnect. You might send longer messages, ask deeper questions, or reach out more often in hopes of restoring the closeness you once shared. But ironically, this effort can sometimes intensify the avoidance instinct to pull away. To them, increased emotional engagement can feel like pressure, even when it comes from a place of love. What you see as an attempt to save the relationship may feel overwhelming to someone who is already struggling with closeness. Another common shift appears in the form of sudden busyness. A person who once made time for you now seems constantly occupied. Work becomes more demanding. Hobbies suddenly require more attention. Social obligations multiply. On the surface, these explanations may sound completely reasonable. After all, everyone has responsibilities and personal interests. But when someone is emotionally distancing themselves, busyness can become a convenient shield. It creates space without requiring an uncomfortable conversation. Instead of directly expressing that they feel overwhelmed by the relationship, they simply become harder to reach. Plans become less frequent. Time together feels rushed or distracted. Even when you are physically together, their mind seems somewhere else. For the partner experiencing this change, the emotional impact can be heavy. You might begin questioning your own importance in their life. You may wonder why they suddenly have time for everything except the relationship that once seemed meaningful. The painful truth is that dismissive avoidants often turn toward independence when emotional closeness begins to feel threatening. By filling their lives with tasks, activities, and responsibilities, they create a sense of control. The busier they become, the less space there is for the emotional intensity of the relationship. And while they may not consciously recognize this pattern, the effect is the same. Distance slowly grows. Perhaps the most unsettling moment arrives when emotional walls seem to rise almost overnight. It can feel like speaking to a completely different person than the one you once knew. Someone who used to open up about their thoughts and experiences now seems guarded. Questions that once sparked deep conversations now receive vague or surface-level answers. You may notice a change in their body language as well. They seem less relaxed, less affectionate, less emotionally present. The warmth that once made you feel safe begins to disappear. For someone who values emotional connection, this sudden shift can feel heartbreaking. You might find yourself trying harder to bring the closeness back. You might share more of your feelings, hoping they will respond with the same vulnerability they once showed. But instead of opening the door, they may retreat further behind their emotional walls. This is one of the most painful dynamics in relationships with dismissive avoidance. The more one person seeks reassurance and closeness, the more the other feels the need to protect their independence. Neither person is necessarily trying to hurt the other. In many cases, both individuals are simply responding to their deepest emotional conditioning. One is seeking connection for safety, while the other seeks distance for safety. When these patterns collide, the relationship can enter a confusing and painful cycle. Understanding this dynamic does not erase the hurt, but it can help you see that the withdrawal you are experiencing is not simply about your worth or your value as a partner. Often it reflects an internal struggle that existed long before the relationship began. And recognizing this truth is the first step toward responding in a healthier way, rather than losing yourself trying to hold on to someone who is slowly pulling away. As those emotional walls begin to rise, another change often follows that feels even more unsettling. The person who once shared pieces of their inner world with you slowly stops letting you in. There was a time when they talked about their thoughts, their plans, their frustrations, even small details about their day. It wasn't always dramatic or deeply vulnerable, but there was a sense that you were part of their world. Now something feels different. Conversations begin to revolve around surface topics. When you ask how they're really feeling, the answer becomes short and distant. "I'm fine, nothing much, just tired." Collins, as if the door to their emotional life has quietly closed, and you're standing on the outside wondering what changed. This is one of the most painful moments for someone who values emotional connection, because the silence feels personal. You may start wondering if they no longer trust you, if they've lost interest in sharing life with you, or if you somehow did something that caused them to shut down. But often the reality is far more complex. When dismissive avoidants feel overwhelmed by closeness, they protect themselves by limiting emotional exposure. Sharing feelings requires vulnerability, and vulnerability can feel dangerous to someone who learned early in life to rely only on themselves. So instead of explaining what's happening inside them, they retreat inward. Their thoughts become private again. Their struggles remain unspoken, and the person who once felt included in their emotional world suddenly feels like a stranger trying to guess what is happening behind a closed door. As this distance grows, something else begins to happen that can feel incredibly confusing. The needs that once felt normal in the relationship start to feel like pressure to them. At the beginning, asking for time together, emotional reassurance, or honest communication may have seemed completely natural. They may have even responded warmly. But as the emotional intensity of the relationship deepens, those same needs can begin to trigger discomfort inside someone with dismissive avoidant tendencies. When you express that you miss them, they may hear it as a demand. When you ask for reassurance, they may interpret it as emotional dependency. When you try to talk about the relationship, they may feel like they are being pushed into a level of vulnerability that scares them. None of this means your needs are wrong. Wanting closeness, clarity, and emotional presence is a healthy and natural part of connection. But to someone who fears losing their independence, those needs can feel overwhelming. This is where the painful misunderstanding often begins. The more disconnected you feel, the more you try to restore the bond. You reach out, you ask questions, you try to create space for honest conversation. But from their perspective, this can intensify the feeling that the relationship is demanding too much from them. So instead of moving closer, they instinctively create more distance. It becomes a cycle where both people are reacting to their fears. One fears abandonment and seeks connection, while the other fears emotional engulfment and seeks space. Without understanding this pattern, both people end up feeling misunderstood and emotionally exhausted. As time passes, another subtle but deeply hurtful pattern may appear. The story of the relationship itself begins to change in their mind. In the early stages, they may have spoken about the connection with excitement and appreciation. They may have acknowledged the good moments, the laughter, the emotional bond that was forming between you. But as their internal discomfort with closeness increases, they sometimes begin to reinterpret the relationship in a different light. Small disagreements that once seemed manageable may suddenly become major concerns. They may start focusing more on the flaws in the relationship than the strengths. Moments of tension are remembered more vividly than moments of connection. It can feel like they are rewriting the narrative of what you shared together. For the person on the receiving end, this shift can feel incredibly painful. You might hear them speak about the relationship in a way that doesn't match your own experience. You may find yourself trying to remind them of the good times, the effort you both made, the reasons the connection felt meaningful in the first place. But when someone is trying to emotionally distance themselves, focusing on the negatives can become a psychological way to justify that distance. By convincing themselves that the relationship isn't as strong as it once seemed, they make it easier to step away without confronting the deeper fears driving their behavior. It's not always intentional manipulation. Often it's a subconscious attempt to reduce the internal conflict they feel between wanting connection and fearing it at the same time. At the same time, you may begin to notice that affection and intimacy slowly start fading from the relationship. This doesn't always happen in one dramatic moment. Instead, it unfolds gradually. The small gestures that once made you feel loved begin to disappear. Maybe they stop reaching for your hand the way they used to. Maybe the warmth in their voice feels less present. Maybe the deep eye contact that once made you feel seen becomes rare. Even physical closeness can start to feel different, less frequent, less emotionally connected. For someone who thrives on emotional bonding, this shift can create a deep sense of loss. You might find yourself remembering the early days of the relationship, wondering how something that once felt so alive could suddenly feel so distant. It can feel like watching a candle slowly burn out. The light is still there, but it's getting dimmer with every passing day, and because dismissive avoidants often struggle to openly discuss their emotional changes, you may never receive a clear explanation for why the affection faded. The absence of clarity can make the experience even more painful. Your mind may search endlessly for answers, replaying every interaction, analyzing every detail in hopes of understanding what happened. But sometimes the fading intimacy is not about a single mistake or moment. It's the result of the avoidant's internal struggle with closeness, reaching a point where distance feels safer than connection. Eventually, the pattern often reaches a stage where their independence becomes stronger than ever. This is one of the most noticeable shifts, and it can feel like the relationship is slowly being replaced by a life that no longer includes you in the same way. They may start emphasizing how much they value their personal space, their freedom, their ability to focus on their own goals. On the surface, independence is not a negative thing. Healthy relationships absolutely require individuality and personal growth. But when independence becomes extreme, it can start to feel like emotional detachment. They may spend more time alone, more time with activities that don't involve the relationship, and less time nurturing the bond you once shared. When you try to reconnect, the response may feel dismissive or distant, as if the relationship has become secondary to their sense of autonomy. For the person who loves them, this can create a painful realization. It begins to feel like you are no longer part of their emotional priorities. The partnership that once felt mutual now feels one-sided. You may start questioning whether you are asking for too much, whether your desire for closeness is unreasonable. But the truth is that relationships thrive on balance. They require both independence and connection. When one partner consistently moves further away while the other tries to hold the bond together, the emotional weight becomes incredibly heavy. And recognizing these patterns, as painful as it may be, is the first step toward understanding what is truly happening beneath the surface. As this growing independence takes over, another shift begins to appear in the way conflict is handled. Every relationship has disagreements. Healthy partnerships grow stronger when two people can face tension, talk through misunderstandings, and find solutions together. But when someone with dismissive avoidant tendencies begins emotionally leaving a relationship, conflict starts to feel very different. Instead of trying to work through problems, they begin to shut down completely. Conversations that once led to resolution now end in silence. You may bring up something that's hurting you, hoping for understanding, hoping for reassurance, hoping for a real conversation. Instead, the response feels cold or distant. Sometimes they may avoid the discussion entirely. They might change the subject, withdraw from the conversation, or simply say they don't want to talk about it. In some moments, they may even leave the room, leave the call, or emotionally disappear in the middle of something important. For the person seeking connection, this can feel incredibly painful. You're not trying to create conflict, you're trying to fix something that feels broken. But instead of feeling heard, you're left with silence. Over time, this pattern can create a deep sense of emotional loneliness. You begin to feel like you're the only one fighting for the relationship, the only one willing to face the uncomfortable conversations that real love requires. Meanwhile, the person you care about seems to treat emotional discussions like something to escape rather than something to resolve. What many people don't realize is that conflict can feel extremely threatening to someone with avoidant tendencies. Emotional tension can activate the same internal alarm that closeness does. Instead of seeing disagreement as a chance to strengthen the bond, they may interpret it as proof that the relationship is becoming too intense, too complicated, or too demanding, and their instinctive reaction becomes distance. As this pattern continues, the relationship may slowly enter what many people call the slow fade. This is one of the most confusing experiences you can go through because it doesn't look like a traditional breakup. There is no clear ending, no honest conversation where someone says they are leaving. Instead, the connection just begins to dissolve over time. Messages become less frequent, plans are postponed or cancelled, moments together become shorter and less meaningful. Weeks may pass where you feel like you're barely connected anymore, yet no one has clearly acknowledged what's happening. Living inside this slow fade can feel like emotional torture. You are constantly stuck between hope and reality. One day you might feel convinced that the relationship is ending. The next day they might send a message or show a brief moment of warmth that gives you hope again. And that small spark of hope can make it even harder to let go. Your mind begins searching for signs that things might return to the way they once were. You remember the early days, the moments when everything felt easy and real, and you hold on to the belief that maybe those feelings are still there somewhere. But the slow fade creates a situation where you are emotionally waiting for something that may never come. Instead of closure, you're left with uncertainty. Instead of honesty, you're left with distance that grows quietly over time. One of the reasons this slow fade happens is because dismissive avoidants often struggle with direct emotional confrontation. Ending a relationship requires vulnerability. It requires acknowledging feelings, explaining thoughts, and facing the emotional reaction of another person. For someone who has spent most of their life avoiding emotional intensity, that kind of conversation can feel overwhelming. So rather than saying directly that they are leaving, they allow distance to do the work for them. They may convince themselves that fading away slowly will hurt less than a direct conversation. They may believe that if the connection simply disappears over time, the breakup will feel less painful for both people. But for the person experiencing it, the opposite is often true. The lack of clarity creates even more pain. Without honest communication, your mind fills the silence with questions. You may find yourself wondering if you should wait longer, if you should try harder, if you should reach out again to fix what feels broken. The absence of closure keeps the emotional door slightly open, even when the relationship itself is quietly fading away. As this confusion builds, the emotional impact can become incredibly heavy. When someone you care about slowly withdraws without explanation, it can trigger deep feelings of self-doubt. You may start questioning your worth in ways you never expected. Thoughts begin to appear that weren't there before. Maybe you wonder if you were too emotional, too needy, too available. Maybe you replay conversations in your mind, trying to identify the exact moment where everything started going wrong. You might analyze every detail, every message, every memory, hoping to find an answer that will make the pain easier to understand. This emotional spiral is extremely common when dealing with avoidant withdrawal. When clarity is missing, the human mind naturally tries to create its own explanation. Unfortunately, many people end up blaming themselves for something that was never fully within their control. They assume the distancing happened because they weren't enough in some way. But the truth is far more complicated. Avoidant behavior is deeply connected to internal attachment patterns that existed long before the relationship began. The withdrawal you're experiencing is often less about your value and more about the avoidant's internal struggle with emotional closeness. Still, knowing this doesn't immediately remove the pain. When someone you love becomes emotionally unavailable, it can create a deep wound. You may feel rejected, confused, and emotionally drained all at the same time. The person who once made you feel safe now feels distant and unreachable, and the silence between you can begin to feel louder than any argument ever could. During this painful stage, many people make a mistake that comes from a completely understandable place. They start chasing the connection harder than ever before. The fear of losing someone can activate powerful emotional instincts. You may feel an urgent need to repair things, to show them how much you care, to remind them of what you shared together. You might send longer messages, trying to explain your feelings. You might ask for conversations, hoping that if they just understand your heart, the relationship can be saved. You might even try to prove your love by becoming more patient, more forgiving, more willing to wait for them to come back. But here is the painful reality many people eventually discover. When someone with strong dismissive avoidant tendencies is already pulling away, chasing them often pushes them even further into distance. What feels like love and effort to you may feel like pressure to them. The more emotionally intense the situation becomes, the stronger their instinct to escape that intensity. This creates one of the most heartbreaking cycles in relationships. The more one person reaches out for connection, the more the other pulls away to regain emotional space. This is why understanding these patterns is so important. Without that understanding, people often lose themselves trying to hold on to someone who is already emotionally leaving. They give more energy, more patience, more emotional effort than they ever imagined possible, hoping that love alone will be enough to bring the relationship back to life. But love cannot survive in a space where only one person is fighting to keep it alive. Recognizing this truth is not about giving up on love. It's about protecting your emotional well-being. It's about realizing that your value does not decrease simply because someone else cannot meet you at the same level of emotional connection. And it's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful step you can take is not chasing someone who is leaving, but beginning the journey of reclaiming your own peace, your own clarity, and your own sense of self-worth. When you finally begin to understand this painful cycle, a question naturally rises in your heart. If chasing only pushes them further away, then what are you supposed to do instead? When someone you love is slowly pulling away, every instinct inside you may scream to fight harder for the connection. Your emotions may urge you to send one more message, ask one more question, try one more time to explain how much they matter to you. But the powerful response that often changes everything is something most people never expect. It is not force, it is not persuasion, it is not convincing someone to stay. The most powerful response is emotional regulation and space. This does not mean shutting down your feelings or pretending you don't care. It means stepping back from the desperate energy that comes from fear. When someone is withdrawing, reacting with panic often deepens the distance. But when you begin to slow down your reactions, when you give both yourself and the other person space to breathe, something important happens. The emotional pressure that was building between you begins to release. Instead of chasing someone who is running, you create a moment of stillness. And that stillness allows you to reconnect with something you may have forgotten in the middle of the chaos, your own stability. Choosing space is not weakness, it is strength. It means recognizing that you cannot force someone to stay emotionally present. It means respecting your own dignity enough to stop begging for love that should be given freely. When you shift your energy away from trying to control the outcome of the relationship, you begin to regain something incredibly valuable, your sense of inner balance. Suddenly your world is no longer entirely focused on whether they will come back or continue leaving. Your focus slowly begins to return to your own healing, your own life, your own sense of peace. Interestingly, something else sometimes happens when distance is created in a calm and respectful way. For a person with dismissive avoidant tendencies, emotional space can reduce the sense of pressure that caused them to withdraw in the first place. When they no longer feel pursued or emotionally cornered, their nervous system often begins to relax. The relationship no longer feels like something they must escape in order to protect their independence. Instead, the silence can create a space for reflection. This doesn't guarantee they will return or suddenly change their attachment patterns, but it does allow something that was previously impossible to occur. When the emotional intensity settles, they may begin to think about the relationship differently. They may start remembering the positive moments they once pushed aside. They may feel curiosity about how you are doing. They may even begin to question whether distancing themselves was the right decision. For someone who values independence deeply, the absence of pressure can sometimes bring clarity that emotional confrontation never could. However, this moment is not about waiting in silence and hoping they will realize your value. That mindset can keep you emotionally stuck. The real purpose of space is not to manipulate someone into returning. The real purpose is to give yourself the opportunity to step out of a painful cycle and begin focusing on your own healing, because whether they come back or not, your emotional well-being deserves attention. This is where the deeper work begins. When a relationship with an avoidant partner starts falling apart, it often activates wounds that go far beyond the relationship itself. Feelings of abandonment, rejection, and emotional insecurity can surface in powerful ways. These reactions are not signs that you are weak or overly sensitive. They are signals pointing toward your own attachment patterns and emotional history. Sometimes relationships become mirrors that reveal parts of ourselves we didn't even realize needed healing. Instead of turning that pain into self-blame, this moment can become an opportunity for growth. You begin to explore your own emotional patterns with curiosity rather than judgment. Why did this relationship feel so difficult to release? Why did the distance affect you so deeply? What part of you was hoping this person would provide something that perhaps you never fully received before? These are not easy questions, but they are incredibly powerful ones. As you begin answering them honestly, something remarkable can happen. The focus of your emotional energy shifts. Instead of constantly analyzing the other person's behavior, you start investing that energy into understanding yourself. You begin learning about attachment styles, emotional needs, and the patterns that shape the way people connect. And through that understanding, you start building a stronger relationship with the one person who will always be present in your life, yourself. Reclaiming your self-worth is one of the most important steps in this journey. When someone pulls away, it is easy to internalize the distance as a reflection of your value. You may unconsciously believe that if you were more attractive, more patient, more understanding, or less emotional, the relationship would have survived. But real love does not require you to shrink yourself in order to keep someone close. Real love allows both people to exist fully as they are. Your need for connection is not a flaw. Your desire for emotional presence is not weakness. Wanting honesty, closeness, and effort from a partner is not asking for too much. These are fundamental parts of healthy relationships. When someone cannot meet those needs, it does not automatically mean something is wrong with you. It simply means the connection may not have been built on compatible emotional foundations. As you slowly rebuild your sense of worth, you may start noticing small but meaningful changes in your life. The thoughts that once revolved entirely around the relationship begin to lose their intensity. You start reconnecting with activities, friendships, and passions that remind you who you are outside of the relationship. The emptiness that once felt overwhelming slowly becomes space for new experiences, new connections, and new possibilities. Healing does not happen overnight. Some days you may still feel the pull of memories, the longing for the person you once believed would stay. But each time you choose self-respect over emotional chasing, each time you choose growth over self-blame, you move one step closer to emotional freedom. And eventually, you arrive at a deeper truth about love itself. Love is not meant to feel like a constant struggle to prove your worth. It is not meant to feel like you are begging someone to see your value. The healthiest relationships are built on mutual effort, emotional safety, and shared willingness to grow together. When two people are able to meet each other in that space, love becomes something supportive rather than something exhausting. The experience of loving someone with dismissive avoidant tendencies can teach powerful lessons, even if the relationship does not last. It can show you how important emotional compatibility truly is. It can reveal the strength you carry within yourself, that it can guide you toward relationships where closeness is not something one person fears, but something both people welcome. So if you find yourself standing in that painful moment where someone you care about seems to be leaving, remember this: their distance does not erase the love you gave, their withdrawal does not define your worth, and the end of one connection does not mean the end of your story. Sometimes the greatest transformation begins the moment you stop chasing someone who is walking away and start walking back toward yourself. And in that journey, you may discover a deeper kind of peace, a deeper understanding of love, and a future where connection no longer feels uncertain, but secure, mutual, and real.